Welcome to the webinar on FDA-iRISK 2.0. More than 600 people have registered for this event, and we're glad you could join us. We hope the information we present today will be useful to you. I'm Susan Cahill of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and I'll be your moderator. I'd like to begin by thanking the Joint Institute for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition for hosting this event, and the staff at both GIFSAN and FDA for their support. Our first speaker, Dr. Jane Van Doren, is Director of the Risk Assessment Branch in the Division of Risk and Decision Analysis at FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Our second speaker, Dr. Yuan Chen, is an interdisciplinary scientist in the division and is the FDA lead on the FDA-iRISK project. Our third speaker, Greg Paoli, is the principal scientist at Risk Sciences International, with whom we've worked closely over the years of this project. The purpose of this webinar is to introduce FDA-iRISK 2.0, the enhanced version of FDA's novel food safety risk assessment tool. As of today, version 2.0 will be available at the URL that you see on your screen. And today's presentation will include an overview of the purpose of FDA-iRISK, how it works, and the new features in version 2.0. We'll also provide a demonstration and examples, a summary, and opportunities for questions and answers. Now, we recognize that many of you might be new to FDA-iRISK, so we've structured the webinar to accommodate both current and new users. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Jane, who will give you a brief overview of the purpose of FDA-iRISK.
Thanks, Susan. Before we get into specifics, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to this novel to give you a general idea about what it is and why it's important to FDA and to stakeholders. I'll also give you a preview of what it can do, including an example of a risk ranking report. FDA-iRISK is an interactive, web-based system that enables users to conduct fully quantitative, fully probabilistic risk assessments of food safety hazards. It does this with built-in model frameworks and automated features. We undertook 2 external peer reviews to validate the tool, one focused on microbial hazards and the other on chemical hazards. The reason FDA-iRISK is important to FDA is that it's filling a major need in the food safety arena. It enables us to produce faster, more user-friendly, risk-related information that can contribute to timely decisions. It can compare public health risks across many dimensions, across different foods, contaminants, production practices, and population groups, for example. Making these kinds of comparisons in a consistent way is something we couldn't easily do in the past. Also built into FDA-iRISK's architecture is the capacity for users to predict and compare the effectiveness of various interventions. I just mentioned that the ability to consistently compare risk across many diverse dimensions is one of the novel capacities of FDA-iRISK. Other novel capacities that have also been available from the outset include how relatively quickly users can conduct risk assessments and evaluate the effectiveness of interventions. Plus, the unprecedented platform FDA-iRISK provides for global data sharing of risk assessments. Launched version 1.0 in 2012, and since then we've made a number of enhancements. You'll hear more about that from Yuan in the next section. To give you a sneak peek at what FDA-iRISK can do, we provide an example of the way in which this tool can be used to compare or rank risks of multiple food hazard pairs. In this example, 5 food hazard pairs are ranked by DALYs per year as the public health metric. But other metrics are available, for example, total annual illnesses, also shown on this report. FDA-iRISK can compare risks from a single contaminant in multiple foods, multiple contaminants in a single food, contaminants in multiple foods. Besides summary reports like this one, FDA-iRISK also produces full reports that include data, rationale, and assumptions. So who is FDA-iRISK intended for? FDA-iRISK is intended for hands-on use by risk assessors and food safety professionals who need to compare or rank risks, or who need to predict the impact of food production and handling practices and interventions. Risk managers are among the most important indirect users. They identify public health questions that need to be addressed by FDA-iRISK and put to practical use the public health metrics and other information generated by the tool, informing decisions about food safety policy and other issues. Academicians and others can use it as a research tool. Indeed, FDA-iRISK can be used by anyone in food safety, including those who need a stage for collaborating and sharing data and information. We are grateful to the many partners who collaborated with us to create some of the more recent enhancements available in FDA-iRISK 2.0. They include the 5 experts who conducted the first peer review focused on microbial hazards, and the 5 experts who conducted the second peer review focused on chemical hazards. We're also very grateful to the 9 experts from government, industry, and academia who helped us beta test version 2.0. In the interest of time, I won't name the individuals involved, but I'd just like to say that we couldn't have done this without them. The tool is better for all of their input. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Yuan, who will discuss the features in more detail.
Thank you, Jane. First, my thanks also to the audience for joining the webinar. It's very exciting for us to introduce what's new in FDA-iRISK. I'll begin with how FDA-iRISK works to set the stage and hopefully to put the new features in context for all of you, including those who might be new to the tool. FDA-iRISK is a dedicated food safety modeling tool that enables users to create food hazard scenarios to represent risk, to predict risk, and changes in risk. This is a broad cartoon view of how it works. There are 3 parts: the user's role, what FDA-iRISK does with data, and what happens afterwards. On the left, the schematic shows that the user is required to enter data for 7 elements to reflect a food hazard risk scenario using the model framework and templates in FDA-iRISK. The middle shows that the system then automatically integrates the data and predicts public health outcomes. The beauty of FDA-iRISK, we think, is what happens after the user gets the first report. On the right, the schematic shows the flexibility of the tool. The user can save the data and loop back to change elements of the risk scenario to simulate different interventions. The capacity to ask what-if questions make FDA-iRISK particularly useful to address food safety issues. And I will explain more about what-if analysis later on because we've added a major new feature to enhance this capacity. Now, a little bit more background. To create a risk scenario, the user needs to provide data and information for 7 elements, which are the food, the hazard, the population of interest, process model, consumption, dose response, and a daily template. By process, we mean food production, processing, and handling practices. and DALY stands for Disability Adjusted Life Years. It's a common health metric useful to compare illnesses with different severity. What we see in this figure is the relationship of the 7 elements of a risk scenario. When the user creates a risk scenario in FDA-iRISK, it must include data and information for the 7 elements in order to predict risk to the consumer, which is what we care the most about in food safety. The fundamental approach, this fundamental approach in FDA-iRISK has not changed in version 2. At a deeper level, what we see in this figure is the model structure for microbial hazards. The square boxes in the left column are user inputs. The circles in the 2 columns on the right are model outputs. FDA-iRISK does calculations through Monte Carlo simulation when the inputs are represented by a variability distribution and are probabilistic in nature. The circles represent intermediate outputs such as those in a contaminated serving or final outputs in a report such as the mean risk of illness per serving. And in the overview, Jane mentioned that some of these outputs are included in the summary risk ranking report. Notice that in the 2 columns on the right, it shows 2 parallel tracks for concentration and the prevalence of a hazard in food. And this is done for computational efficiency. FDA keeps track of prevalence and concentration separately until the point where the risk of illness is calculated. And I might note that this has implications for the exact equation for a dose response model, which I will get back to later. FDA-iRISK uses this structure to compute the risk from microbial hazards, which is acute in nature, and the risk from acute exposure to chemical hazards. The model structure is essentially the same for chronic chemical hazards, except for how consumption is defined. The number of consumers, consumption per day, and the exposure duration are the inputs. A lifetime average daily dose, or LADD, is calculated for chronic exposure. As an output, the mean risk of illness per consumer instead of per serving is predicted. And so Jane mentioned that we've conducted 2 peer reviews of the underlying model structures for both microbial and chemical hazards. The reviews cover the mathematical functions that connect the model inputs and the outputs. It is through the built-in model structures that FDA-iRISK automates part of the risk assessment process. So that was a brief overview of how FDA-iRISK works. To our audience, just a reminder, if you have any questions about the purpose of FDA-iRISK or how it works, you can send a note to the Q&A box. Okay, now I'd like to take a few minutes to highlight new features. Okay. This is a screen capture of the online interface. You will see more of it in the live demo. Users access FDA-iRISK through the web interface, where they can create, save, and share data and scenarios from anywhere they connect to the Internet. We've added major features in 3 areas to expand modeling capacities, enhance the user interface, and improve reporting of results. What you will see in FDA-iRISK 2.0 today is the outcome of efforts to address peer review comments, particularly from the second peer review and the long-term recommendations from the first peer review. We also consider user feedback and questions, including those from the first launch webinar. I will focus this section on new features in the area of modeling capacities because you will see in the demo highlights of user assistance and reporting aspects. I will describe key computational improvements in modeling capacities, give some examples of some of the other improvements, and highlight a major feature called sensitivity analysis. To help illustrate the features to both current FDA-iRISK users and those who are new to the tool in the audience today, I'll highlight the new features in the context of user inputs and the data required to create a risk scenario. So I will describe examples of new features in terms of what the users can do and what data are required to populate the process model, consumption, and dose response as an element in a risk scenario. Once you populate the elements of a risk scenario, it's relatively easy to create a risk scenario in FDA-iRISK and run a report. A key computational enhancement is the improved treatment of rare event in the process model, and I'll elaborate on that in the next few slides. Another major change is the capacity to create an exposure-only scenario, which may be useful in a situation where there is insufficient knowledge about dose response. This feature allows users to calculate exposure to a pathogen or a contaminant and skip the dose response element entirely when they do not need to know the number of cases, for example. An exposure-only model may be useful also regarding chemicals, producing an output for comparison with a reference point. Some of the key improvements are behind the scenes, such as improved stability analysis to better determine when the Monte Carlo simulation is deemed to have converged, and features such as parallel queuing to streamline reporting. Before I give further examples, I'd like to take a step back and describe briefly what FDA-iRISK does in terms of the process model elements. Again, by process, we mean production, processing, and handling steps. So a process model is very much like a flow chart in a HACCP plan or a food safety plan in a simpler fashion. FDA-iRISK provides a template for the user to develop the process model with multiple steps. Choose a process type to describe the effect of each step and complete the model. There are a number of built-in process types in FDA-iRISK to describe typical steps in the food chain where contamination can change by growth, inactivation, environmental contamination, and so on. Because of these built-in templates, FDA-iRISK is well-suited to investigate the effectiveness on risk of different control measures applied in the food chain. There were 9 process types in version 1, again, for the user to choose from to describe how and by how much contamination may be introduced, increased, or decreased at different steps in a food process model, and these remain in version 2. The rare event feature, which is a key improvement, is in the modeling a step where contamination occurs. The increase by addition process type now can handle rare event additions. And by addition, we mean adding contamination at a step. For example, increase by addition with a likelihood of 0.05%. And this is an example from a case study we did for Listeria monocytogenes in cantaloupe. For example, at a step for contamination that might happen at a processing facility, assuming that the likelihood is 0.05% or 0.0005, we can now enter this data point in FDA-iRISK. This feature can be used to model a rare event addition in a manufacturing step or elsewhere in the food chain, such as contamination of leafy greens on the farm or contamination from consumer handling in the home. Some other computational improvement in version 2, there is a new feature called maximum population density, which allows you to set a maximum in the process model. There's a new choice in the consumption unit for chronic chemical exposure. Depending on the data available, the user can choose gram per kilogram body weight per day or simply gram per day as a unit. By now, we all know that FDA-iRISK can compare risks from multiple food hazard pairs. Another computational improvement is the ability to turn off a feature called annual scaling. This feature was always on in version 1 because it's required for risk ranking involving food hazard pairs that include both microbial and chemical hazards. New in version 2 is the ability to turn the annual scaling feature off when you run a report on chronic risk scenarios, which is useful to compare lifetime risks. So I'm using a series of screen captures from case studies that we've done to illustrate the new features. So this is an example of setting MPP, or maximum population, MPD, I'm sorry, maximum population density. In the process model for this risk scenario, Listeria in soft cheese, where the process model starts at retail. So what you see on the screen right now is the definition of initial conditions, which include initial prevalence, concentration distribution, and the size of a food unit. And so we got this data from a U.S. survey study that was published back in 2003. And you don't see it in this screen, but later on we also include in the process model a consumer storage step where a growth occurs. So we set the MPD to 9 log at the beginning of the process model so that at a later step, if the concentration due to growth exceeds the maximum population density, then FDA-iRISK will automatically limit the concentration to 9 log. This feature can be used to limit growth to reflect generally accepted maximum population of a pathogen in food that supports its growth. I think I have an example here to see the actual implementation of how to set that up. Setting MPP is also a process type. The templates for process type, now 10 in total, again provide flexibility in the FDA-iRISK tool. And you may recognize that some of these process types represent common or major process mechanisms in food production, processing, and handling that affect the prevalence level and spatial distribution of the organism due to inactivation, growth, and other changes. FDA-iRISK provides templates to enter data on consumption as well. For an acute exposure scenario, such as what we see on the screen right now, that involve, for example, consumption of soft cheese in a listeria in soft cheese risk scenario, the number of eating occasions and serving size are the data required. And here we have 3 population groups of interest. On the other hand, for a chronic exposure scenario, such as arsenic in apple juice, the consumption is defined by the amount consumed per day and body weight for the population in population group in different life stages that are involved. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have data in a different unit, the amount per kilogram body weight per day, that can be entered as well. I might note that data source for consumption can come from a government survey, such as data from the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey in the U.S., or literature and other sources. For our international audience, you might find that consumption data or data for any other elements in the risk scenario, data from your own region might be more relevant to the scenario of interest to you. In FDA-iRISK version 2, we've added over 3,000 new features. So here are more examples of new features. We've added a number of new dose-response curves, such as the examples that you see on this slide. We've also added more distributions to help characterize variability in contamination and consumption patterns. And you'll see some of these distributions in the demo or when you have a chance to use the tool. Also of note, in FDA-iRISK version 2, we have refined how the beta Poisson and exponential dose response equations are implemented. And it has to do with the precise way that the dose is computed. And so now the exact dose, instead of mean dose or average dose, is implemented in these dose response equations. And you will see the new equations in the technical document that is available today online. FDA-iRISK provides pre-structured dose response models, and the user select a template to define the parameters. Here are 2 examples from case study that we've done to validate the functionalities of some of these new features. On the left is a beta Poisson model for salmonella. You'll notice that the dose unit is CFU for salmonella dose response, and the probability of effect is on a per serving basis. I have a chart to show it here. And on the right, that is an example of dose response model for arsenic. We chose the PRODIT model to represent the median dose response for adverse effects, and the dose unit is different here. It's milligram per kilogram body weight per day. And the predicted probability of adverse effect is for long-term exposure. We developed the dose response models for arsenic for both lung cancer and bladder cancer by approximation, actually replicating a set of models that were published in the FDA draft quantitative assessment of arsenic in apple juice, which was published in 2013. And the health metric template, such as DALY, is the same in version 2, very similar to how we defined it in version 1, so I don't have a particular example. So now, after the user populate the elements of a risk scenario and create the scenario itself, they can use it as a baseline to evaluate alternative scenarios. As I mentioned earlier, built-in FDA-iRISK is the capacity to ask and get answers to what-if types of questions. What if we have a more susceptible population and the dose response is different? What if consumption is different? What if interventions are applied? What would be the predicted change in risk to the consumer if different assumptions are made or there are changes in practices? And so here's an example to illustrate the new feature, the sensitivity analysis feature, which can be used to more quickly evaluate alternative scenarios to answer these kind of questions. This example is a scenario for Listeria monocytogenes in soft cheese. And from a drop-down list, you'll see that next to the model element, we can choose to change any of the 4 model elements, for example, process model, consumption, dose response, or health metric to conduct the sensitivity analysis, and that's what we did. We changed the data for growth at the consumer storage stage in the process model. So you'll notice that in the baseline, we represent growth with a triangular distribution with a maximum of 5.79 log. And so if the extent of growth is reduced, for example, as a result of consumer education or other interventions to improve storage temperature in the home, we could expect a reduction in the amount of growth. And so the scenario that we run is to make the assumption that the maximum growth is reduced by 1 log or by 2.79 log, and enter this alternative scenario and then ask iRISK to run the sensitivity analysis. And this is what we get. So we see that the predicted risk in total DALY now is reduced from 11.1 to a lower number. And these results are, of course, generated based on the data and the assumption that we make when we did the case study. So through the sensitivity analysis, we can see that we can explore the impact of reducing the extent of growth on the burden of listeriosis to the population of interest. And again, more generally, the sensitivity analysis feature can be used to evaluate the impact on risk from any control measures and interventions. Apply in the process model, or we can evaluate the impacts from changes in consumption or changes in dose response. And now that I've highlighted some of the new features, before we go to the demo, very quickly, in FDA-iRISK 2.0, we've made improvements to the user interface, added additional validation of user input. There's a new feature to the ability to visualize those response curves and distribution charts. There's also improvement in data management. The users now can create multiple repositories. They can more easily share data when others share data and scenario with them. They can now more easily copy and import the share model elements, and you will see more of this in the demo. And lastly, there are enhancements in output formats and report layout. For example, there's also more options for risk ranking endpoints. In addition to the DALY template, users can now choose the total number of illness, the mean risk of illness, as the metric for ranking where appropriate. So with that, I will turn it over to Greg for the demo.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. So I will begin the demonstration with the home screen. The home screen of iRISK is where you will go to log in after you have registered. So you'll see a link to register on the screen here. Once you have registered, you'll receive an email to confirm that you are in fact who you say you are, and then you'll be able to return to the website and log in, which you would click right here. Once you've logged in, you will see, first of all, it will show you who you are logged in as. You are actually able to use multiple accounts if you choose to. The main page of iRISK that you will see has 4 tabs: Home, Models, Reports, and Repositories, and also the Help tab. I'll first click on the Help tab so that after the webinar is over, you will know where to go to find some help in using iRISK. This page shows you a quick start tutorial, which is where we would recommend everyone start when they're first using iRISK. It walks you through how to create the types of models that are in the sample repository that each user has access to. You'll also see a very detailed user's guide, technical documentation for those who want to know more about what's under the hood, and links to this and other webinars, as well as the ability to contact us through the contact form here. The 3 main tabs demonstrate what you're typically doing with the iRISK application. You're either building a model, you're running a model, or you're trying to share aspects of your work with other colleagues and receiving their invitations so that you can look at their models. What I would first suggest everyone do when using iRISK for the first time is to go ahead and immediately make a copy of the sample model repository. So if you look at the iRISK, when you first log in, every user has access to a repository called the sample models. It has 5 hazards, as you can see here, 6 foods, 6 process models, and with those combinations, a total of 7 risk scenarios. So you can see all of the lists of what is in that repository here, the hazards, the foods, and so on. You will also see that you can view each of these elements, but you can't edit them. So in order to use iRISK and experiment with it, you'll want to make a copy of the sample models, which you can do by clicking on the Import button beside. And I can import it to a new repository, or I can import it to some other repository that already exists. I'm going to create a new one and just call it Copy of Sample Models. Once I click Import, it will confirm that that has been successful, and you'll see that you now have your primary repository, which is empty as a new user, but you also have a copy of the sample models that you can now edit. So you can change all of these models. I would encourage people to go ahead and just change models and experiment. You can't break them. You can always delete them and start again. So just go ahead and play with these models. If I return to my primary repository, you'll see that it is empty. I next want to show the concept of sharing in iRISK, which is a very useful tool. So I'm going to go to another account where I'm logged in as my colleague at demo.org. And you'll see that I have a very small repository, and I want to share that I want my colleague to share that with me. So if I go to the Repositories tab, I can invite my colleague. So now I've successfully shared that very small repository with my colleague. If I return to me as another user, so now I'm me at demo.org, and I go to the Repositories tab, I see that I have an invitation from my colleague that I can choose to accept. If I accept it, and I return to the Repositories tab, or to the Models tab, I now see that I have access to my colleague's sharing repository. So that's a convenient way of sharing work with colleagues, to share the work, for example, to create a common library that people can all have access to. I'm now going to walk through the use of iRISK, but I'm going to start with an example of how you create the reports. If you want to create a report, there's two ways of running a report. You can either create a report which simply shows the hazard elements, or sorry, the model elements, or you can actually run the simulation model to generate risk estimates. You also have access to previous reports that you have run, which you can see in a list here. You can control the level of detail in your reports. If you just want a summary, you can have that, or you can have every detail in your use of iRISK and all of the notes that you've had in either PDF or Word format. The Excel option just shows some graphs. If you look at a completed iRISK report, you will see that it provides a disclaimer first, but then a summary page of all of the scenarios that you've chosen to run, as well as however much detail that the user has entered to describe each and every one of the assumptions required to build a risk scenario. So this user has been particularly good at documenting their work and generates 57 pages of information, all of which comes from the user typing in descriptions. For example, they've included a reference to for the dose response curve for aflatoxin B1, and so on. So any information that the user puts in can be returned to the user in the form of this report. So that's the benefit of documenting your work, which we're all encouraged to do. I'll now walk you through some of the major model elements very quickly. The first thing you want to do is click on the Models tab and go into our sample models that we can now edit because we've made a copy of it, and look at some hazards. I'm going to focus for a moment on a salmonella, and once I just click on the edit key beside, or the edit link beside salmonella, I have access to all of the things that are linked to the hazard salmonella within iRISK, which includes the name I've given to it, the default units of it, and any dose response curves that I have assigned to it, and any health metrics that I have assigned to salmonella. I also have access to any process models that salmonella has been included in, and any scenarios that have been constructed that employ this particular hazard. If I click on the dose response tab, I can edit my dose response curve. I could add a new dose response curve. So I'll first edit a dose response curve. You'll see that it provides a chart of the dose response curve, so you can confirm that your dose response is appropriate. And I can change the units to make this for example, a less virulent strain of Salmonella, I could change that number to make the beta value higher. When I refresh the chart, you will see that the dose response is now representing a less virulent pathogen. I can also add a new dose response curve. I don't have to have just one dose response curve. I can have multiple, and I could choose to have an exponential model, and I'm going to call this Salmonella mildus, just to make it seem less virulent. And I could choose to have an exponential model instead of a beta Poisson model, and choose the R parameter here to make it represent a mild pathogen. But once I chart that, I get some feedback to confirm that the dose response looks appropriate. Within the dose response, or within the hazard area of the tool, I can then choose dose metrics. In this case, we have a DALI metric assigned to Salmonella, which we have acquired from the literature. If I look at that, I can see that it is assigned the value of 0.019 DALIs per case. If I look at the notes, I can see that this has been acquired from a particular source, namely Scallon et al., and so on. So in this case, you have a particular note. The user can add a new note if they want to expand on the justification for that or provide any other documentation. And this capacity to provide notes is everywhere throughout the tool, and it's context dependent so that you will see the notes associated with the activity that you're currently doing. If you want to simplify and are not yet comfortable with the concept of a disability-adjusted life year or other health metrics, you can create essentially a surrogate measure where you simply assign the value 1, which gives you rankings which will be equivalent to the number of illnesses. So if I do that, I can now construct scenarios and just use the simple DALI measure with the value of 1. That may allow you to produce some models before you fully understand the DALI concept. The next thing I want to show you is the concept of a process model. So here I'm going to show you the list of process models that are available. We have Listeria in cantaloupe is one that Dr. Chen mentioned. I'm going to just show you what that looks like. Every process model has, at the very least, initial conditions and possibly additional process stages. In this case, the initial conditions are described in terms of the unit mass, the concentration. You'll notice that the user has the choice to choose a distribution of concentration, or they also have the option of a fixed value. Most quantities in iRISK have these options, and the and the distribution choices are available in many places. You can refresh the chart to make sure that the distribution is what you expected, and you can also set your maximum population density here. The next thing that you would do is add any additional processing stages to your model. In this case, the model has 2. Handling at home and consumer storage. Here you see the increase by addition step and the probability that has been assigned to that addition. And again, you have a choice of determining the amount of contamination that gets added as a fixed value or a distribution. You can add new processing stages. There is no limit to the number of stages. So for example, if I wanted to add retail storage to the model, I simply type it in here. I can add it to the model before I fully characterize it by simply calling it a placeholder. And you'll see that it has put it by default at the end of the process model. I would want to make that obviously happen prior to the handling at home, so I'm going to move that process stage up the list using the little arrow buttons so that the retail process happens before the home process in the model. I can then go in and edit my retail storage model and change it to, for example, allow a small amount of growth. For example, if I thought that was likely, or if I only wanted to know what the effect would be. I can simply add a fixed value of a 1 log increase. So most of the parameters in iRISK for microbial hazards concentration tend to be on the logarithmic scale, as that is the standard practice. And I can close that and see now that I have 3 process models, 1 with growth, 1 with addition, and 1 with a little bit more growth. I could then go ahead and run that scenario and see what the effect is, either as a permanent part of my model or a temporary thing, just to see what the change might be. Okay, I'm now going to switch over to another model element, which is the concept of a consumption model. When you define a food, for example, if I look at cantaloupe, I will see consumption models that I can assign to that food. In this case, I have acute exposure types, which are appropriate for microbial hazards, and acute chemical impacts, which determine are defined by the number of those events, the number of eating occasions per year. Here you see 59 million eating occasions per year, and I can edit that value here. I can also indicate how much is consumed in those eating occasions, either through a distribution, in this case an empirical distribution, which we might get from a database, or I can choose a fixed value fixed value or another distribution type. As an example of a chronic consumption model, we could look at tortilla chips, which are linked to the aflatoxin hazard in this case. Look at the consumption models. And here we would be defining the average consumption per day for different population groups and indicating the body weight of those users. You can also choose, as was indicated, the option of changing it so that the units of the consumption are actually grams per kilogram day, in which case you don't need to specify the body weight because it's embedded in the consumption measure. I'll quickly switch over to a chemical hazard. For example, we'll take a look at aflatoxin, just to show you some of the things which are different when you're doing the chemicals. I have a dose-response curve for cancer endpoints for aflatoxin B1, and I can change the dose-response curve and I can take a look at the value in a graphical form. If I want to add a additional dose response curve to cover acute exposure or acute aflatoxicosis, I can enter that information here. I have to specify whether the exposure is acute or chronic so that iRISK knows how to handle it, and then indicate whether the dose is in mass or mass per kilogram body weight, which would be more often. And then I choose from the available dose response curves for that type. In this case, there are, this selection, there's a longer list of possibilities for chronic exposure models. Oops. In the process models, you'll see that the list of possible process model types is slightly different in for chemicals. For example, you won't see increase by growth, since that is specifically related to bacterial pathogens, but you will see other process types which are used to reflect changes that you expect in the level of chemical hazard due to processing in various cases. So that changes, as well as the treatment of process models is obviously done differently between microbial hazards and chemical hazards, partly due to the logarithmic scale and the mathematical properties of microbes. So just going back to the concept of the reports, you can look at reports and you can decide to rank in different ways. You could either use to rank by health metric, such as DALYs, or you can just choose to rank by illnesses and other variations. You can sort your list of reports. If you've done a lot of reports, you can filter them and view them in either PDF or Word format. Obviously, if you want to use the Word format, if you would like to further edit the document that results. With that, I would just encourage you to use the tool and feel free to share amongst your colleagues your work and get used to the idea of collaboration. That's one of the primary purposes of iRISK, either internal to an organization or between organizations. And with that, I will hand the reins back to FDA.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And again, if you have any questions about the new features, the demonstration, feel free to send us a question in the Q&A box. In the interest of time, we would just like to mention that the slide presentation will be made available when the recording of the webinar is posted, and Susan will cover a little bit more about this in the end. So in summary, we hope that FDA-iRISK will be useful to our food safety stakeholders, anyone who is interested in having access to a web-based tool that facilitates quantitative risk assessments. At FDA, we continue to use the tool in a number of ways. We are building new scenarios and expanding our library of data. For example, we're developing scenarios for salmonella in shell eggs, salmonella in spices, chemical contaminants in produce. We have been using the tool to help us evaluate the effectiveness of different interventions. We've also tried to use it to simulate different outbreak situations. We are exploring ways to connect FDA-iRISK to other modules and possibly other tools to help us answer new questions. FDA-iRISK has given us an excellent platform to collaborate with other federal agencies, stakeholders in other countries, the private sectors. So we expect that to continue to be a very useful tool for collaboration. So what is needed to advance risk ranking tools, like FDA-iRISK and their applications? This is very much a relevant question today as it was in the first FDA-iRISK launch. In order to reach its full potential in advancing risk knowledge, we hope that FDA-iRISK can help stimulate collaboration and leveraging resources among stakeholders from government, industry, and academia, for example, by increasing understanding of data needs for risk assessment and encourage data sharing. We also want to continue to better articulate risk management questions so that the right scenarios can be developed, validated, and used. And to find ways really to collaborate and work together on targeted data collection so that we can develop risk scenarios to better understand the risk associated with a baseline situation and compare those situations to an outbreak situation, for example. Earlier, we showed this diagram to illustrate how FDA-iRISK works. This is also part of our overarching view of the tool. A design principle behind FDA-iRISK is that we hope that the combination of the user's technical knowledge and the reliability associated with a peer review tool like FDA-iRISK with the computational infrastructure would ensure more productive risk assessment activity and would serve as a platform for easier way to share data and share risk scenarios. We hope that over time, FDA-iRISK can capture data from scenarios and outcomes to build a global picture of risks and intervention. And I would just also want to echo what Jane said at the beginning of the webinar. We wanted to acknowledge the many experts who provided invaluable input and critique to assist us in developing and refining the FDA-iRISK system, both version 1 and version 2. Enhancing the FDA-iRISK system is an ongoing process, and we will continue to develop this tool as advances in the risk assessment field emerge. With that, I would like to hand it over to Susan for closing remarks.
Thanks, Yuan. That concludes today's webinar, but before you log off, I want to tell you that the recording of the webinar that Yuan mentioned will be available at foodrisk.org. Also, that if you'd like more information about FDA-iRISK, you can visit the foodrisk.org website anytime or the FDA Food Safety Risk Assessment webpage. And the URLs for those are on the screen you're looking at now. And finally, I'd like to thank our speakers very much, Jip San, and to thank you for your participation. Thank you.